perhaps it's easy to start with what the problem was. Pushkin House, you know about its extraordinary history when it was founded, the extraordinary role it played in London during the Cold War and afterwards. But to most of those involved with it, 50 years after it was founded, there was a structural problem, which is that it was sitting on or in a rather wonderful property in Ladbroke Grove in West London, most of which was let out as accommodation to pay for its own upkeep, and a downstairs room was used once or twice a month by the Pushkin Club to talk about Russian culture and have Russian cultural events, which is a wonderful thing, but it was sort of an underuse of assets, and it needed renewing. And it was not at all clear what the outcome was going to be. I mean, there were some who felt that the way we are is just fine. There were some who felt that actually the simplest thing to do was to turn all the assets into cash and use it to fund events, bursaries, one-off occurrences. It would have been perfectly effective as a fund. So there was, as you can imagine, people felt strongly about it, and it was not an easy... There was animated discussion and controversy, to put it very mildly. But what emerged was a decision to renew and revive Pushkin House on a number of levels. The first decision was to keep it as rooted in bricks and mortar, so to speak, that it should be a house where Russian culture took place. We decided to sell the old Pushkin House and to set up, to use part of the money to buy somewhere else, but to retain some funds to enable it to function. Because the problem with the old Pushkin House was that it was valuable but had no money to do anything. And if things worked out, one will be able to convert that into the ideal, which was a cultural centre. And I still remember being rung up by someone and told, just spotted this rather nice house just around the corner from the British Museum. Problem is it's in an awful state. It's a grade 2 star listed building, early 18th century, predates Pushkin, possibly built in the year of the foundation of St. Petersburg, used as solicitors' offices for years, divided up into a rabbit warren of little rooms, no water supply above the basement, very difficult to do anything with it because of planning regulations and so on. So we bought it. It was a risk because all elements of this were naive and risky, and I could well understand caution and skepticism, and there were cautious people and skeptics. Because of the way the market worked, we had to buy it before we'd got full planning permission to do the things in it which would be necessary to make it into a cultural centre. I mean, among other things, for example, not only was there no water below ground level, and how do you get pipes up through the walls of a listed building, but what is now the main function room upstairs was divided in the middle by a wall into 2 rooms, but that was a Victorian wall, not a modern wall. And the planning principles in this country are not, the aim is to restore things to their original state, which is what we wanted to do, but you have to retain anything which is a historically interesting feature. And it's perfectly plausible that a Victorian wall could have been regarded as a historically interesting feature, and we wouldn't have been allowed to muck around with that. So there was a lot of that kind of uncertainty. So from a group of bedsits, basically, or small flats which could support 1 room downstairs for the activities of the Pushkin Club, we had a staffed, full-time, open cultural centre without, at that stage, asking anybody for a penny. We needed to show what we could do with the resources we had before going out to people and saying, we need more resources, and it had to be able to wash its face and use what it had effectively. There's a downside to that. I think that some people are not fully aware that Pushkin House is a charity. They think that because it has a nice building in central London. It must be wealthy in some way. But that's a message which constantly needs to be reinforced. The crucial thing about Pushkin House is that it is a fully independent charity. It belongs to nobody and never did. Its essence in the 50s remains its essence today. That is to say, a place which is in nobody's pocket but is respectful to everybody. A place where people can come and say things which one may agree with, one may be offended by, and that's fine. When we were considering the relaunch, it was extraordinary. I think the thing which took me by surprise most of all was being asked, well, who's behind this? Who's doing this? Whose interests is this serving? What's the line that's being pushed? And that's a very difficult thing to free oneself of in a Russian context. And perhaps because it's such a difficult thing to free oneself from in a Russian context, that makes Pushkin House continually important precisely for that. Pushkin House is here as a home of Russian culture. You know, for some, Russian culture is a succession of canonical works which need constantly celebrating. And for others, it's an edgy, difficult, slightly offensive, contested, and constantly evolving thing, and everything in between. And Pushkin House has to reflect that diversity. And of course, for those for whom Russian culture is a comfort blanket, the difficult things are difficult. For those who like their culture contemporary and edgy, the classics are boring and a bit safe. The event which for me was in some ways the most memorable, the most surreal, happened before Pushkin House opened, and probably shouldn't have happened. We just about got permission to hold it, but I think if we look back on health and safety grounds, we would have regarded ourselves as deeply irresponsible. The house was still partly a building site, but we agreed with, was it Russians in the City? That we would hold a kind of inaugural party here to celebrate the fact that it was about to emerge from its cocoon. And we worked with the builders to put planks down where there were holes in the floor, but it was absolutely not like it's looking now. It was, and we didn't quite know how many people were going to come, and I think we underestimated. And the place was packed with substantially young people, substantially young Russians and people interested in Russia, the house top to bottom. And it felt like a kind of warehouse party in this absolutely non-warehouse space. It was irresponsible, but it also had a kind of funkiness to it, which you couldn't recreate in a classic space. And it was important for kind of bringing in to the idea of Pushkin House in Bloomsbury Square, people who had no notion of the Pushkin House in Ladbroke Grove, people who had no notion that there had ever been a 50-year history, people for whom this was a new and a now institution about to open for them, and who could feel a sense of involvement, initiation, privilege. One of them went on to become who was there and had no particular previous connection with Pushkin House, went on then to become a co-chair of the trustees, so it kind of worked in bringing people in.